Hello gamers, Totem God here, and today we are going to be talking about a PoE League starter. This is going to be for patch 3.24 Necropolis League, and we are going to be talking about the Arc Totem Hierophant. So this build is a bit of a classic. It's probably had a usage rate, of it's probably been played in every league, but it's not super popular, right? Especially as of late. I feel like Arc's heyday was kind of back in the Incursion days with Arc Trap and everything like that, and at that point I saw more people playing Arc Totems and things like that. But nowadays, I think a lot of people think the skill is just not very good. It's been power crept on, it doesn't do enough damage, etc. And I think that there's a lot of fairness to some of those criticisms. But I think as a league starter in particular, it actually works really well, especially on totems. It's super cheap to gear because the gear typically isn't very expensive. And on top of that, not a ton of people are playing totems. It clears pretty well. The damage is pretty good for clearing. It's not the best boss DPS, but it does acceptable boss DPS, I would say, at least early on. And I think the playstyle is pretty intuitive, if people like it, of course. I think that's a big point of contention. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, a strong build. It shreds the campaign. And, I definitely wouldn't, I don't want to lie to you, I would not use this for Uber bosses, at least not without some major adjustments. So potentially in the future we can do a video on how to upgrade this to tackle the Ubers. But currently this is really meant to just kind of get you into the league, get you into maps, get you through tier 16s, and kind of like taking out the normal bosses, right? And then what I would typically do at that point is build a different character for Uber, maybe a Trapper, a Miner, maybe Ice Spear Totem, something like that. So we'll have stuff like that coming through the pipeline on the channel. But for now, this is just going to be kind of like a true league start type guide. Fast, efficient, quick is what we're trying to be with the build, right? And have it be very cost effective is the idea. So to start, we're going to hop into a map. I always kind of just do this really quick to kind of just show off the build's basic playstyle. And then we will talk about the gear and other things. Okay. So basically, there's not a ton to this playstyle. I typically like to play the leapfrog style of play with this particular build because it's honestly not quite as tanky as something like Ballista Totem. And also with Ballista Totem, the totems actually get placed a lot closer to you than with Spell Totems. The Spell Totem, you don't really have to drop them at your feet. You can kind of put them ahead, right? So it lends to this playstyle kind of better. It doesn't slow you down as much when you do it with Spell Totem as when you do it with Ballista Totem. And Ballista Totem is also way tankier, right? So you don't really have to worry as much about running into packs and stuff like that like you do with this build. So typically how I play this build is I put the totems down. As you see, I try and run laterally. And that is because the totems don't have a true taunt, but if they make first contact with the mob before you get in the mob's aggro radius, they will attack the totem. So you can kind of use this to your advantage because they'll send their first attack on the totem, and this could be like the whole pack, for example. And if there's a lot of extra projectiles coming that way, right, you don't really want to be there when you're kind of running up to meet where your totem was. So you just kind of sidestep out of the main line, and all the projectiles sail by you. And then if you have the cannot be chained to God power, then that protects you from any sort of chaining shenanigans, and it's usually a pretty smooth experience. So as you can see on the boss, we put all our curses on the boss, and we put our Cold Snap, and I'll explain what these things do in a bit more detail once we get into the actual build. But we have 4 curses: Enfeeble, Elemental Weakness, Assassin's Mark, and Conductivity, and then Cold Snap, and then we have Sigil Power as well, but that is something you don't always need to use, more of a bossing thing, I would say. So that was just a quick demonstration and a little bit of an explanation on how I play the build, And now we can jump right into like the build itself and kind of like the mechanics, right? So I think that the way I like to start this is by talking about the gear, and then we'll move on to the skill tree, and we'll talk about some other more niche things. So the star of the show, metaphorically speaking, is definitely the Soul Mantle. This is kind of what makes the build possible, in my opinion, but not only does it make the totem builds possible, but it's also kind of like a crutch and a downside all wrapped into one. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. So it's very difficult, in my opinion, to make a totem build that is a spell totem build that isn't a self-contained totem, something like Shockwave Totem, obviously, or Holy Flame Totem, that doesn't use Soul Mantle. And the reason is you just give up too much damage by using another chest, right? It just doesn't really make sense because you gain an extra link by using this, right? And then also you gain at least pretty much 100 to 120% damage at all times, pretty much, by having the curses on you. And how that works is the totem curses you when the totems die. And by totems dying, it can just mean that they were replaced by other totems. As you can see, I can generate curses very quickly. And then if you see this jewel, which is right here, you get damage per curse. And this can go from 10 to 20, basically. So it's quite a bit of damage, especially if you have a reasonable, good jewel. You're probably going to have at least 5 to 6 curses up at a time. So you're kind of probably thinking, well, okay, that's, sounds kind of good though, right? So like what's the problem? Well, the thing is you're really compensating for two things. Multiple totems is a less multiplier, right? As well as the totem skill itself that's embedded in the Soul Mantle is also a less multiplier. Now, less multipliers are kind of tricky because the one that's embedded in the totem in the Soul Mantle right here, at least for now, this one is just a less, right? But for this, it's a bit more because this is a 21% less damage, but at the same time, there's the opportunity cost of you also don't have like a damage gem in there, right? So you have to take the spread between them. So you're not just losing 21% damage, you're losing 21% damage plus whatever you would have had in that slot instead. And the idea is that basically to even get totems going, like spell totems like this, you're losing so much damage. So you really, really have to use this almost because it's the only thing that really provides like a solid 7 link. And it provides us not only the 7 link, but it provides the additional damage from the cursing, right? And without that, you really start to struggle with damage. This build in particular really struggles with single target damage. And if you didn't use Soul Mantle, it would be worse. You may ask, well, do you need to use multiple totem support? And that's a really good question. And the answer would be yes, though. Because not only would your single target suffer even worse, because this actually enhances your single target, but the clear would start to become noticeably different. And basically, while you're leveling through the campaign, even through, honestly, white and yellow maps, the game's density, while it can be pretty good at times, it's not anything super insane, generally speaking, right? And, just placing one totem at a time pretty much handles things. It's not like a super concern or a big deal. Like I said, it shreds through the campaign. So really no issues there. But it's really when you get into red maps, and more in particular, the league mechanics. So, for example, things like Expedition, where lots of stuff are popping up in the ground at once, right? And some of these mobs are kind of tanky. And when you have one totem you're putting out at a time, it just kind of doesn't really cut it, honestly. It doesn't do enough damage, and with how Arc works, it loses damage per chain. So what ends up happening is, it's hitting kind of like the fodder mobs, and if it's not killing them in the first burst, then basically what's happening is, or if it's not killing enough of them, basically, it could kill 9 of them, because that's what it chains to, right? But if it doesn't kill the 10th, 11th, and 12th, then when it fires the next arc, it's going to hit those first, and when it actually goes back to the rare, the thing that you really need to kill and do priority damage on, the arc is already going to have, lower damage, right? So by adding multiple totem, not only do you add single target DPS, which is much needed, but you also add a better clear, right? And you're kind of clearing all the trash quicker to be able to get your totems to focus the single target on the mobs where it's needed most, which is the rare enemies. So that's basically the reason why we have to use multiple totem, and why we, obviously you have to use spell totem. So by de facto, you basically have to use Soul Mantle in order to get the damage where you need to be. And that's a bit of a problem because Soul Mantle is not a very good defensive item, right? So armor is a huge thing in this game, for example. Physical damage, super scary. And there's no armor to be had on Soul Mantle. And in conjunction with using the Soul Mantle, typically you're kind of forced into more offensive heavy options, right? So either 2 wands, staff. You sometimes can go scepter and shield and stuff like that, but typically it's not an armor shield. It's a +1 totem shield, or a highly specialized damage shield, or a damage shield with 1 totem added, right? So it's not like you're getting a like a 2.5k armor shield ever in one of these builds, typically speaking. So, and those are 2 huge sources of armor. So they're really 2 big areas where your physical mitigation is kind of taken away from you, and that can definitely be a problem for the build in terms of survivability. And I would say that tends to be the main problem for the build. And the kind of thought process, I think, is that, well, you're a totem build and you shouldn't need tons of survivability, right? Because the idea is you shouldn't be getting hit because the totems are doing the damage for you. And, that is a very reasonable kind of way to approach things. However, the game, I feel like, has power crept a bit past that, and there's now stuff that can kind of really just jump on you, get on you, stay on you, do a lot of damage to you. There's stuff that can off-screen you from a very far range, etc. Right? So you really do need, I feel like nowadays, more than before, a bit more defense. If this was like 3 years ago, I'd be comfortable just running like, very basic setup with like Wrath Aura or something like that. But now I actually use Determination, and we'll get into that in a bit. But yeah, I think you just need a little bit of additional armor to take the edge off. And you combine that with some of the other physical mitt, and you combine that with, you're trying to get HP from 3 different sources: health, energy shield, and mana. And, sometimes it still doesn't quite feel like enough, and that's what we're going to be talking about when we get into our second item here, which is the staff and why we chose this. And it's basically kind of related to trying to make up for some of that lack of defense, which is going to sound weird at first, because what does a staff have to do with defense, right? So, to understand what a staff has to do with defense, we're going to hop into the passive tree here. And basically, you need to look at the staff nodes. Now, staff is kind of unique and interesting because a lot of the other weapon types in the game, you need to actually hit with said weapon in order to generate an effect from them. For example, there's melee daggers and spell daggers, right? But the problem is that if you're using a dagger as a spellcaster, if you try and access the dagger nodes, a lot of them, it's damage with daggers. So what that means is that you actually had to have hit the target with the dagger to take advantage of those nodes. If you try and implement them in PoE on the totem build, they just don't register. You don't really have any damage. You won't see an effect. So that's how you can tell that it's not working. And if you go to the staff nodes here, which we'll check out in a second, you can see that it says while wielding a staff. And that's a critical difference, an important difference. And that's basically what we're playing around. And if you look, they're actually pretty decent clusters, right? And this is kind of like what I stumbled upon when I was trying to think of like a way to make the build a bit more tankier while still maintaining the types of damage we need. So this is a pretty good cluster. But then when you look at the staff mastery, that's when things really get interesting, right? 60 to critical strike multiplier if you haven't dealt a critical strike recently. So if you're new to PoE, how a lot of things tend to work in this game, whether they be uniques, even really powerful ones, or nodes on the tree, or ascendancy nodes, a lot of things have power built into them, but they also have like a drawback, especially if they're really powerful, right? So 60% critical strike multiplier for one node is kind of unheard of. And you can see this by referencing it with other sources on the tree, right? Crit is way less valuable than crit strike multiplier. So even though this gives 30 crit with 30 multiplier, you know, it's still nothing like this node, right? And then over here, 30 multiplier for one node. You can come down here, 30 multiplier for one node. So there's nothing that really kind of stands out like this one. And that's because the idea is that you're not really supposed to have it all the time, right? Because it's if you haven't dealt a crit recently. But for us, we're a totem build, and we actually never crit ourselves, right? It's all the totems doing things. So when you take this on a totem build, it's actually active 100% of the time, and that's super powerful. And that's basically how you're trying to design builds, I would say, in PoE a lot of the time. You're trying to find cases where the weakness, your build can completely circumvent it, and you still gain the strength. So that's something we're going to be looking to do a lot in this guide today, and I'm going to explain to you kind of like step by step where we do that and how we do that for this build. That way you guys have kind of like a core understanding of how things work, and it's not just like copy and paste and go, you know, and you don't really know. Maybe you missed a certain thing and you're not really sure why your damage is low or something like that, right? So it kind of starts with that cluster, and then, you know, the other thing you notice is that there's some other clusters here that give block as well as damage, right? This cluster here and this cluster here. And they give like a fair amount of block, honestly. And this cluster leads to a very popular staff node, which is super good, counterweight. This is a really, really strong node, like this. And this node is pretty good as well. So it kind of got me thinking, like, you know, maybe for a bit of additional defensive layer we can have in there is actually block. And block kind of sounds like it's not an intuitive choice for this type of character. And it's really not, because typically on a totem build, what you're trying to do is just survive the big hit, right? You just need enough mitigation, enough health pool to survive that big hit, and then you can kind of like run away, regen, and then take it again, stuff like that. Now, when I say big hit, you're not tanking a Shaper Slam or something like that, but basically a big unavoidable hit is what you're kind of imagining in those types of scenarios, right? And block doesn't really tend to help with stuff like that, because the idea is kind of like, well, you know, if block doesn't block for that hit, then you're kind of just screwed, right? So yeah, it could help, especially if you get high enough. Maybe it's even likely to help, but there's always that 25% chance that it doesn't block at all, and you just, you know, die anyway, right? So block isn't truly the type of mitigation we're looking for, but really with this build, what the idea is we're kind of getting it at such a low cost that it can turn out to be kind of powerful. And the idea kind of is that if we can prevent a lot of the smaller hits that come in, basically, then we have more HP available for if we get like small hit into big hit. Because that's another way that you can definitely die in this game and on this build, is you actually have kind of a very high threshold for eating unavoidable damage in terms of your raw effective health with this build. But the problem kind of comes up into, well, if something else has hit you first, chunked you out a little bit, you know, especially your energy shield, right? Because your energy shield has to recharge typically. So that can leave you more vulnerable for the next hit to come and clean you up. And that's what we're trying to kind of like resolve and fix by doing this. So the block definitely kind of helps with that, especially we have it combined with, we have attack block, spell block, and then we have a bit of spell suppression added in on top. And all those things kind of work together to try and prevent some of those minor hits from stacking up too much, to prevent us from getting KO'd by the huge hit, right? And that's basically the idea. And the whole concept, again, is that we're able to do this efficiently through the staff and the nodes, right? While adding in a couple other unique items. And speaking of which, that would be the Rainbowstrides, is the next spell block item. So 20% movement speed, not the best. 20% all res, that's not too bad early game, right? And then 55 to mana, well, I mean, we use that. It's not unusable, right? And then the spell block is the main thing that we want these for. So just with this, it's like if you have a max roll, it's 20 spell block. Then from here, 6, 8, right? So 28 spell block. Then 31 and 37. So already 37% chance spell block just from the boots and the nodes here, right? So not too bad. And then if you come back to the staff, you have 18% attack block. And the staff itself is also not really that bad. I think if you're going to pick any of the staffs from the north, south, east, and west, the west is the best one. But there's really no stat on this item that goes unused aside from sort of the intelligence, but we are an energy shield and mana-based build, so you're even still using the intelligence a bit. And having the extra intelligence on the staff is sort of nice in this league in particular because tattoos are coming back. So what tattoos mean is that, you know, we can transform some of those intelligence nodes on the tree into things like chaos res and useful stuff like that, right? Without having to think like, oh, we're losing so much, you know, ES value or mana value from those nodes because we kind of have it back from the west staff right here, right? And the main thing about this staff is that it's cheap, right? I'm not going to try and convince you that this is the best weapon in the world. In fact, this is actually it's actually nice having this weapon in a sense because you can upgrade this very easily once you do start to get currency, right? You don't have to stick with this, but it's something you can get right away, very early on, especially if you're kind of like a little bit slower. Like I'm 4.5 hours to maps, so this might be like 5 chaos for me, but if you're like, you know, 6 to 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours, 10 to 12 hours, like this thing's probably already like 2 chaos or something like that, you know? And that's insane to just kind of be able to grab it around like the Blood Aqueduct level or right when you're getting into maps. It's a really strong weapon to have for that level, especially if you have the nodes supplementing it, right? So, yeah, so we're using this in conjunction with this, and we already have a decent bit of block. And then let's talk about the star of the show, or the other star of the show. I think I already called the Soul Mantle the main star, but this would be like the new thing I'm adding, kind of like the special sauce to the build, I guess. So the Algor Mortis is kind of insane in my opinion. I don't really know why it's not used more. The Chilled Ground is huge, and it's pretty easy to put down. The Chilled Ground also grants you Frenzy Charges when anything dies on it, no matter what kills it, even your totems. And the Frenzy Charges can be used to put down more Chilled Ground, so it like basically allows you to bypass the cooldown. And obviously, even if you don't do that, then you still have, you know, max Frenzy Charges relatively easily, which is 12% cast speed and 12% more damage, I believe. So that's just really, really strong, right? And that's not even counting the enemies take 35% increased lightning damage. Now that's a 35% more multiplier to them, right? Because it's not like you're dealing 35% increased damage. It's they're taking 35% increased damage. So when an enemy takes damage like that, it's always a more. And then the sap is a 20 to 25% damage reduction for the mob in most cases when your arc is hitting them, because the effect of the sap is based on the damage of the arc, I believe. So super strong item offensively and defensively, and we use all of the stats on it. We use the cold resist, we use the lightning resist, we use the energy shield, and the effect of non-damaging ailments, right? So, you know, just can think of this as almost like another defensive layer, right? Having the sap on top of everything else. Now, this is one that's commonly paired with the Soul Mantle, because when you have the hexes on you, you have to figure out a way on how to deal with them so that they don't absolutely murder you, right? Instead of just giving you a damage boost. And you do that by getting reduced curse effect. Now, this item, a lot of people will probably be a bit confused as to why we're using it, because what's happened is over the years, there's been a lot of sources of reduced curse effect added into the game, right? So it used to be that you pretty much had to use the Kikazaru rings, and I think at one point, you know, you had to use 2 of them, and it wasn't even enough to basically, you know, at that point, it wasn't even enough to fully cap you against the effect of curses on you. But now, just having one like this and then giving it the caster quality brings it to 72%. And then you're able to use your god power here to do the remaining 30. And that's a super easy way to solve the curse effect on you. And it's very budget friendly, right? Because these are super cheap rings. But it's really not just about the budget aspect in terms of why we're using this. Everything on the ring is good. The lightning resist is good. All attributes are needed. The mana regen is great. And then the regenerate 3 life per second per level is very underrated. So this was buffed from 1 to 3 kind of a while ago, and I think it's really flew under the radar. Having close to 300, regen from one item that's also kind of helping you fix another huge problem with the build, aka the effect of curses on you, is just really nice. And it comes at a very cheap cost. So regen is part of the problem that we were talking about before, right? Of, well, how do we fix that situation where we get hit a couple times, right? And then we get hit with the big hit and then we die because we're not at full. As we mentioned, the block helps out there, right? But regen also helps out. And regen particularly helps out in the case of energy shield. Because when you look at our stat spread here in terms of the health, energy shield, and mana, you'll see that the energy shield is a non-trivial part, basically, right? 1500, you're almost close to like half of the life, and you have you're almost the equivalent value of mana there, right? And so this being up all the time is a big change to your survivability level. And unfortunately, when you're playing a build like Arc, it can be really easy for this to be down all the time, because you could take a big hit and lose it all, or even lose a bunch of it in smaller hits. And then when you're about to regen it back, you just happen to get hit at the wrong time. It stunts the ES regeneration, maybe removes the last bit of the energy shield, and you can be perpetually sitting at like 0 ES for way longer than you're probably going to be comfortable with, right? And now other builds, like maybe a freeze pulse build or something like that, they don't have to worry about this as much, because typically they'll get hit, but then the enemies will be frozen. So what that means is that they have plenty of time to kind of like recover the energy shield, right? Whereas in this particular case, you're constantly exposing yourself to new threats when you're blasting through the map, so it can be difficult to kind of find that period where you don't get hit by anything sometimes in a map that's very projectile heavy. And that means your shield will be down pretty much all the time. So what I actually do with this build, and part of the reason why I use the Kikazaru, is I transfer my life regeneration to energy shield. Now, this seems a little bit crazy, I think, to some people probably, because not having any life regen feels spooky, right? But again, you have to kind of take the whole package, okay? So especially when we're in the end game and we have Anathema and everything, we have Enfeeble on the mobs. If they're tough mobs in like an expedition or something, they've got the sap from the chilling area. We have a really strong health pool here, right? We have 3,500 life, and even if we start taking damage into our life, like our shield gets depleted, then we're taking damage into our mana, right? So it's being split between mana and life, so it's not like our life is just plummeting down. We have the block, we have the spell suppression, we have the spell block. So when you add all these things together, your life really doesn't crash as hard as you expect it would in some of these maps. And what that means is you can really take advantage of your life flasks, which is great, because typically what happens in these totem builds is your life flasks actually compete against your regen, which is bad, right? If you take a big chunk of damage that goes into your life, now your energy shield is down for like however many seconds, and you instinctively pop a life flask, and what's happening is your regen is basically getting completely devoured by your life flask. It's like, why do I even have the regen? You know what I mean? Because I'm using the life flask. Whereas in this particular case, the regen is always working on the energy shield on the outside, and you are getting the full effect of your healing flask on the life on the inside. And you don't even have to run 2 flasks to make this work. In fact, the flask setup in general is a bit lazy. This should definitely be a granite flask right here with increased armor. But yeah, you can run one flask, you can run another resistance flask, you can run a damage flask. You could run one health flask, 2 quicksilvers, a armor flask, and then the crit flask. There's a ton of different ways you could set up the build, but the point is that you really can rely on your life flasks on this build way more than you think. And the only thing I can tell you is that you just gotta try it, and you'll kind of see what I mean after playing the build for a little bit. So that's why I really like the Kikazaru, and the idea of this is to kind of add on to the regen that's brought by the Kikazaru. Right now, in the final version of the build that I'm going to show you in a few moments when we transition over to the PoE, I actually don't have this included, nor do I have this. I have 2 different items here, and I actually prefer that version more, and I'll explain why. But you can still definitely use this option if you want to really invest into the life. One of the downsides, though, is that you can't corrupt any items when you have this, obviously, which can kind of remove a little bit of endgame power, which we'll talk about way later in the video. So, having mentioned this, I'll quickly go over the Anathema. So in case, you guys aren't familiar with Anathema, this basically just allows you to have a lot more curses, because your curse limit is equal to the power charge. That's the main reason we run it. And, we mainly use 4 curses. You could use 5. We use Enfeeble, Elemental Weakness, Conductivity, and Assassin's Mark. Now, you also could use Temporal Chains, but I find that largely it's pretty unnecessary most of the time, so I just stick with those. And then the only other item we have to talk about is the Darkness Enthroned. So the Darkness Enthroned is interesting because remember how we talked about using Determination earlier, right? And the problem with using Determination on a build like this is because there's no armor from the chest, and because there's no armor from like a super tanky shield or anything like that, the Determination feels a bit naked, right? And if you were to turn on the Determination just itself, it probably nets you around 3 to 4k armor. And that's not worthless, but it's pretty mediocre. And then when you add in maybe an armor flask or something like that, maybe you're starting to creep up towards 10k, like 8k or something like that. But it's not really that good considering that the armor flask is conditional. So what we've done here is a bit of a jewel tech, an abyss jewel tech. And it basically uses the same logic that we used over here with this staff mastery. And the idea is that 28% increased armor if you haven't killed recently. Now in a totem build, you never kill recently. So what that means is that this is going to be up all the time. And when it's in a Darkness Enthroned, it has the effect close to doubled if you have a relatively high one. Now you see it's 91% here, right? So basically what that means is you're getting almost 100% armor from this belt if you have 2 of those jewels in here. And then if we open up the PoB, you can see we have 2 additional Hypnotic Eyes that also have the mod on the tree. And, those basically tie up to like 50 to 60 between the 2 of them, right? So you're basically getting probably like 150, 160% armor just from Abyss Jewels. And when you factor that into the equation, you end up with about 10k armor, even with no flask active, which is pretty good. It's respectable. And when you combine that with the other physical mitigation tools that we were talking about, like the endurance charges, as well as the chaos golem, and then you also have the Lunaris soul here, you start to actually get a decent amount of Fizzment. Now, you're not going to tank Shaper Slam or anything like that, but you're going to be way, way, way tankier against those like Legion Archers, the Expedition range mobs, etc. You know what I mean? So I think it's well worth it. And it's not something you necessarily need to invest into early on. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But by the time you get to the late game, I think it is very, very valuable. So, that is where the last item kind of comes from. And then hopping into the PoB. So first, I think I'm going to talk to you about the differences in the PoB version and the normal version. And then we're kind of talk about some of the nodes on the tree and stuff like that, make you aware of them, how good they are, etc. So, as you can see, we changed out our helmet for Willclash. And then we changed out our just normal rare amulet for the Ephemeral Bond. Now, these items kind of work together, but we'll just look at the Willclash first. So 5% chance to block spell damage per power charge, 5% increased elemental damage per power charge. Now, the drawback of this item is supposed to be that you lose all power charges when you block, but you can't lose static charges. So you're always going to have your 5 power charges, which means you always have 25% chance to block, and you always have 25% increased elemental damage. So again, we're kind of circumventing the rules of this item, right, by overriding it with a different mechanic. And that's how you play PoE. So 25% spell block is crazy, and what it basically lets us do is it lets us drop all of this. Now, when we drop this, we do lose some attack block, right? But it saves us a lot of points, lets us reinvest in damage in other places, and we're still able to maintain our spell block, and then we can always anoint counterweight, right? So we keep the damage here, we keep the spell block basically. We actually make the spell block better because now we don't have glancing blow right here. So when you block damage from a spell, you block the full hit and not just 35% of it, which is huge. And yeah, it's just a big point saver, right? And it's super, super huge for the build. So you can see that we distribute the points. I think this is what we invest into, which is a really nice cluster over here after we took some of the stuff out. And it also, I think, frees us up to get more attribute points and stuff like that, which you actually need in this build. The one downside of the staff is that it does have a very high strength requirement that is a bit unnatural for what you'd normally be doing with a totem build. So let's get into the other aspect of the Willclash, though, right? So it's great just from being able to give you the spell block, because keep in mind, the spell block is the one that we're really concerned about. The attack block is nice, but the spells are what can really hurt this build because they're going to be ranged in a lot of cases, right? And we're going to be able to avoid a lot of the melee attacks. You know, it'd be nice to be able to block more ranged attacks from afar, but we already have the armor to kind of deal with those worst case scenarios. So what we need now is ways to mitigate the spell damage, and that's what we have in the spell block, and especially when you combine it with the 39% spell suppression, or effective spell suppression, when you take chance for it to be lucky over here. And these don't combine together, like added on top of each other, but the block will apply first, and then the spell suppression applies next. So you basically, if you don't fully block the hit, you have a 39% chance to take half damage from it, which is obviously really strong. So going back into the other function of this helmet. So you'll see here, you gain a power charge every second if you haven't lost power charges recently, right? Now, when you come down to the bond over here, you see it has quite a few good stats on it. It has mana regen, elemental resist, lightning damage for power charge. We need all of that, okay? And we don't really suffer from the reduced charge duration because our charges are flat. But then we come up to 35 critical strike multiplier if you gained a power charge recently. Now, this is a bit of a problem, right? Because since all of our charges are flat, we have no way to gain a power charge, right? We can't go anywhere from 5. And that's where the Willclash comes into play, because not only does it give us the ability to gain a charge, right? But it's very easy to corrupt because it's very cheap. Which that allows us to spam corrupt until we get the +1 power charge. Okay, so you can just keep buying them and either keep corrupting them with Vol Orbs, or you can throw them in the Temple of Atsuwato corruption mechanic. And basically you just want +1 to maximum power charge and basically anything else. And the idea here is that because you can tick up +1 charge, right, this will basically always be active. And even if this goes down because, you block, and when you block, you turn off the ability to, gain a power charge every second, right? Because you've lost power charges recently. So even though this would turn off for 4 seconds, the timer on the Bond amulet is also 4 seconds. So they're pretty aligned. Now, there can be times, depending on how things exactly play out, right, where, you may not have 100% uptime on this critical strike multiplier if you've gained a power charge recently. However, for the most part, it is going to be up 100% of the time, and especially when you consider that you can also gain power charges through Anathema. So every time you cast a curse, you have a 10 to 20% chance to gain a power charge. And we're going to be manually casting curses a lot, which I'll explain very soon. So basically, these items have kind of like a great synergy together, this and the Anathema as well as the Willclash, and they allow you to use every aspect of the Bond amulet, which makes it even stronger than normal, essentially, right? And it's funny, you can look at these items and you're like, well, there's not much life on these, and it's like, yeah, there's not really that much life, but we have a high amount of energy shield, have a high amount of life, and we have a high amount of mana. Something to keep in mind in this game is you don't necessarily have to have a ton of life if you can get effective health in other ways, right? If you're a new player, you've probably been bombarded with you need life, you need life, you need life, and generally speaking, it's pretty good advice. But when you're supplementing with other areas, with energy shield and mana, especially if you can keep your energy shield up, like the reasons we swapped our regen over to energy shield here, then you stand a very good chance of not needing as much health as you think, essentially, right? So that is basically how the Bond amulet works. And that is basically the last item to explain on the character. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hop through the tree here and explain some of the more important notables or the jewels and stuff like that. And then we'll kind of talk about item priority and everything like that. So I think the most important thing is you need one of these Sleepless Sentries jewels. Onslaught is just too good. It's 20% movement speed, and this was a big weakness of totems for a long time, but when this got added to the game, it was super huge because, now you just got 20% more movement speed that pretty much everybody else was running, and now you can run it too. And this is actually pretty easy to get. You just need I believe it's an eye level 75 cluster jewel, a medium one of the totem variety. You can double check that on PoE DB to be sure. But basically you get one of those, and then you alt-aug it until you get the Sleepless Sentries node, and then you regal until you get something like another good notable over here. Now, there are some useless notables. Ancestral Reach is probably the best notable, but there's also a bunch that are in very similar power level to Ancestral Reach, and Ancestral Reach is a pretty common one. So this is not really that hard to do. Now, granted, if you're really broke and you can't afford to do that, the most important thing is to just get a Sleepless Sentries. So you don't even have to have a secondary notable. Just this in itself is really strong. And another thing you could look into is if there's any really cheap Megalomaniacs with Sleepless Sentries. Typically, totem builds, like I said, they're not like super popular, so that may be possible. A Megalomaniac is a medium jewel that basically has notables from all the different types of medium jewels, I believe. So as long as it has Sleepless Sentries and maybe some other semi-useful notables, you could do something like that as well. So yeah, something to keep in mind there for sure. It's just that one's going to be a bit more random, right? Then moving on to some other nodes. This is how we deal with chaos damage right here. So if you look, our chaos emit is already substantially lower than the other mitigations. That's typically normal. And it is kind of hard to squeeze in chaos resonance build. So taking this is a huge difference because, as you can see, we drop a lot of mitigation towards chaos if we don't pick this up, right? So this is super, super helpful against chaos, and it's enough to keep your head above the water, I would say. You're not super tanky against chaos, but If you don't have this, it feels a lot worse. These nodes right here are for resists and attributes, basically. So if you don't need them, don't take them. But if you do need them, take them. It's the same thing with the strength nodes here, needed for attributes. So depending on if you can get those on jewels or something like that, then you can forego having to take those and put the points in other places. We already went over this. This is a really good quality of life node. Cannot be shocked while max power charges, which you will... actually, now that I think about it, if we're going to be using the Willcrash version of this, you're not going to be at max power charges, so you should really just take the damage per charge right here. And this is actually kind of insane because you will have probably 6 charges up a decent amount of the time. So you can have 5 to 6 power charges, 4 endurance charges, and then you're going to have frenzy charges in those tough scenarios where you have the cold snap chilling area down. So you actually get a lot of damage from there. I didn't even put the frenzy charges in here. So this is an interesting one. So people often ask about Arcane Capacitor and like why bother with Arcane Surge. And the reason why you bother with Arcane Surge on Hierophant is because when you buff Arcane Surge on Hyro, you actually buff this 20% more as well. So that's what makes it so strong. So that's why if you see people buffing Arcane Surge and you have things like the Arcane Surge effect, this is a jewel where if you use other Hypnotic Eyes, which we already have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this counts as itself a Hypnotic Eye, so you have 5 in total. So we have 5 Hypnotic Jewels affecting us. 5 times 8 is 40. And we get the maximum effect from this jewel, which is a pretty big damage increase, as you can see. Take it in and take it out. So that's the whole idea between having augmenting the Arcane Surge effect. Now, the real kicker in this, actually I'll touch on this first. So this is just a good damage cluster, but also the 5% damage from hits taken from your totems nearest life before you. Basically like just 5% reduced damage, right? That's absolutely huge. And this is the real kicker, though. I love this. And it's Caster Mastery. 6% cast speed for each different non-instant spell you've cast recently. This was basically made for totems, in my opinion, and made for this multi-curse style. Because basically, our totems are always going to be doing damage, right? So we don't have to pay any opportunity cost for indulging this node. We can just rotate our curses like I was doing in that map. I'll just this down, this down, this down, this down, and you can flame dash around, even counts when you place the totem, right? So you have basically like 8 kind of unique things you can do, and most likely you're going to be using 4 to 5 of them recently at all times. So you're basically like 24 to 30% increased attack speed at all times, which is just absolutely insane for one node. It's a super steal. And then these are the nodes that you replaced the nodes down here with, right, for the spell block. And the spell block mastery over here is really strong as well. And then if you ever need resist, you can always come through the bottom here instead of going over the top. So that's basically a pretty quick overview of the tree and kind of how some of the stuff on the tree works, right? And now we are going to talk about the item. Well, actually, we'll talk about the gem links, okay? And then we'll talk about the item priority. So I'll hop into the gem links for Arc here, right? And basically, what I always tell people when they're doing gems is you always want to double check them in PoB for yourself. Because what you may see here may be different from me depending on your exact gear level than what it is for you. So if you really want to know if you're doing max damage or not, you go into PoB yourself, and basically if you have sort gems by DPS, right, and you have where you did non-awakened here just because it's at the start, right, if you X this out, right, so you only have 5 links, and then you go to add a gem, it'll add the gem in the order that it adds DPS, basically, right? So that's kind of like what you're doing here. And there's a lot of considerations I think you can make on a build like this for how you structure the gems. So the main thing you want to keep in mind is there's absolute DPS, right, which is shown here, but then there's also like your shock percent. Now your shock percent is not really something that can be shown because it's dependent on a mob by mob basis, but it's something you have to think about when you're kind of building a character, because if the more of these sockets that you put just straight raw damage in, the higher the shock percent will go up. However, something like critical strikes, it's not actually augmenting the raw damage of the skill, it's just making the frequency of the critical happen much more frequently, right? So the actual max hit isn't going anywhere. So your potential shock, like your highest potential shock, isn't changing by adding this. It's just giving you more chances to hit a very high potential shock, right? So you kind of have to weigh things like consistency like that, as well as overall DPS, as well as like how is this going to affect my overall shock threshold. And the only way you can really do that is kind of by playing around with it yourself, seeing how much you shock things for, and kind of getting a sense of like, oh, okay, like, you know, I think it'd be better off if I tried this other skill or tried this other gem that, you know, just added a bunch more damage, let me get a higher shock, or I think I prefer having it as right now. See, I tend to like having critical strikes because it helps us reach 100% crit, and 100% crit is just nice for clear especially too, right? You don't end up with the situations where you put the double total down and they don't crit, and then stuff is still alive. So I think pragmatically having increased critical strikes can be good, even if you know, it's not letting you reach the most maximum like shock potential on a single target ever, right? So these are all considerations you have to take into account. The other thing I want to talk about a bit is inspiration. So inspiration is a bit controversial in my opinion, and the reason is you see we have inspiration in now, and our mana cost is still 113, right? So how inspiration works is you're going to cast, like, you have the double totem. So you're going to cast 3 sets of totems, right? And that's going to bring you to the max amount of totems that you can have. And what that means is that after casting 3 sets of totems, you are basically at like 339 mana cost, right? And as you can see, it says after spending 800 mana cost, you lose all your inspiration charges. Now, the problem is once you get all your totems out, right, in 3 casts, you still don't have max inspiration charges. So you have to cast twice more to even get max charges, okay? And then now you're basically at, like, you know, you're close to 500 plus mana. You're close to 600 mana. So basically now you only have 2 casts remaining, right, before your whole thing resets again. So inspiration is a bit of a tricky one like that. And, you know, I think it's mostly going to be used if you're really struggling to maintain the mana. Like, if you don't have good mana regen and your mana is completely out of control, then I can see people running inspiration. But aside from that, I actually think it's kind of inconsistent, and I tend not to like it. Especially because, you know, the thought process, I think, behind inspiration a lot of the times is, well, I'm going to put my totems up and let them sit. And that's a great idea in theory, but in a lot of cases, you're just going to end up having to move your totems for one reason or another, right? The boss moving, the boss may have killed your totems and you have to replace them. You know, you may be moving totems to make them avoid something or something like that, right? Put them in a better position. Or, like I said, the boss just moved. There's tons of reasons why you might need to move them. And that all kind of penalizes a skill gem like this. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. And you can always replace this with something else, like, when this loads, we'll see. Like power charge on crit or cruelty, etc. And you can see you have very similar damage numbers there. But without having to worry about the charges aspect of it at all. So that's kind of how I would go about approaching the gems. And as you can see, we have pretty good damage here, you know, even on a 5-link. So we're going to go into the configuration. And we'll kind of scale some of this stuff back just to give you the most realistic number possible, right? I think we'll scale this back 1. We'll do 5 power charges, that's fine. Maybe we'll take a couple of these off, right? And maybe we'll even do this to 25%. All right, that's pretty reasonable. So I think all the rest of this is fairly reasonable. Oh, we have a stage turned on here. So can we go to stage 0? We can, okay. So this is basically on a 5 link with like, you know, not a lot of stuff active. We can even drop this down to a level 20 and you're still doing like 600k damage per totem and you're on 5 totems, right? So pretty damn good, like basically 3 mil DPS. And if you add back the +1, right, and then, you know, even if you go into the calcs here, or the configuration, and you bump this up, you only get 2 stages on your Sigil of Power, right? Maybe you get 5 instant casts, or 5 non-instant casts, maybe you get 35% shock, you're already up to 800k, right, which is insane. And then, if you add in your 6 link back into the mix, right, we'll say Cruelty, you are over 1 million DPS per totem, which is basically 5 million DPS. And keep in mind, this is constant damage, right? So unless something is destroying your totem, this damage is going off all the time, and your totem lasts 17 seconds, which is huge. So yeah, just very, very strong, consistent DPS. You know, not the best, like not like a trapper, but it's respectable for the type of build it is. It's kind of like the point, right? So let's talk about item priority now. Basically, like, what do you want to get as soon as you hit maps? Like, what's going to be most helpful for you? Well, the answer is by far Soul Mantle. And again, that's because it already has the link inherent into it. So, you know, there's not much that's going to give you more damage than that at a cheaper price. Now again, if you're super fast, like 4.5 hours like me, this might be kind of like 5 chaos, potentially even 10 at that point. Typically, if it's like that high, if it's 10, I'll let it come down a little bit. Usually it's around 5, and I can just kind of snag it. Another thing too is if you have things set up in PoB to particularly alert you to these things being posted, a lot of times, you know, the price variation will be very high early. So if you're kind of on the ball and you have a second monitor, you can kind of snipe good deals, right? So, I mean, some people may be trying to post this for 10, but you can get it for 5 or 3, or in some cases, potentially even 1. So always keep an eye out on stuff like this, but this is going to be the main thing you want to focus on, and then you supplement it with a dual Kikazaru setup. And that's going to just, you know, make things super easy for you in terms of dealing with the effect. You don't have to worry about it at all. And, you know, you have the, then you're going to want to get at least a low-level self-flagnation, like a low-damage one. So you're just at least having something for the curses on you, right? Because even like 60-70% increased damage is way better than nothing. So that's something you're going to be looking out for. What I would say is, like, you don't want to buy things, and I'll mention this again when talking about the weapon later, but especially for things like self-flagnation, if you need to buy a cheap one at the start that's really cheap, that's fine. I would rather you buy a really cheap one that's like 10 or 11 than buy like a 15 that's like 20 chaos or something that somebody's trying to price gouge on, and then have to upgrade it to a 19 or 20 later, right? Because keep in mind, you really want this in the 19-20 range by the late game because it's per curse. So if you start losing like 5% damage on each curse, that starts to add up kind of quick, you know what I mean? Especially if you're preloading totems before a boss or something like that. So, you know, don't break the bank on kind of like a mediocre one. Just get a cheap one and then upgrade it later if you need. Or if you have the currency, just get a good one to start. Yeah, so that's those are like the core items at the very, very start. After that, I don't think you're ever going to have to worry about getting the Willcrash, but at the same time, I also don't think it's a super big factor to have early either. You may actually want to even use a rare helmet earlier in order to help with your resists and stuff like that. So this is going to be super easy to get, I think, but it's not going to be a big priority to get. These are going to be a priority to get, and they're going to be a little bit more expensive at the start. So you can kind of either hold off for a little bit. That I feel like the price tends to drop pretty quick because the item seems to be common, even though it's fairly useful. So yeah, I just let this kind of like sit for a little bit, and usually in a couple hours they crash pretty hard in my experience. So I don't get baited, buying these. Like I've seen them up for 30 chaos before, but that's not like a real price. So maybe it's the real price to the first person who wants to pay it, but other than that, not so much. After that, I would definitely look into getting a Rainbowstride, or potentially even before that, depending on what the prices are. It's a really strong amulet early. I wouldn't be shy on getting the Ephemeral Bond, even if you don't have the Willclash setup, because the amulet is still very strong, especially with the resistances that you're going to be wanting early game, even without the crit strike multiplier, right? And after that, I would probably look at getting Anathema. I think just having the extra curse power kind of dwarfs what you're trying to do with the Darkness Enthroned. But those two are both in the same. Those are going to be like the last things that you get, basically, right? And somewhere in this whole mess, you're going to get your staff weapon. Now, I think for me, this mostly depends on how expensive this tends to be. If it is like 10 chaos or something, and you're coming out of the store with really bad wands, what I think you should do instead is just look for super cheap wands that are just like, a bit better than yours, like maybe 1-2 chaos wands. Toss those on and then hold off on investing into the staff nodes until it comes down a little bit. But if it's like, 3, 4, or 5 chaos and you have it, I would just grab it, because it's going to be a super potent damage increase, especially after you invest into the staff nodes on the tree, right? Like just this cluster alone is going to give you a ton of damage. So I would definitely look into picking this up relatively early. But, like I said, have your options open for potential wands and stuff like that are also really cheap if this is a bit more expensive. How to level the build, right? So basically, this can be played from I would say Act 3 or 4 all the way through to end game, like I was saying before. Is it most efficient to do that? It's probably more efficient to play Armor Brand, to Katava, and then swap over then, or Armor Brand to Blood Aqueduct, something like that. But me personally, I just like playing the totems, and you can go fast enough with it, like it doesn't slow me down a ton. I'm sure I would be faster with Armor Brand, but I just prefer playing this, and there's really no problem in doing that in a League Start scenario. It works perfectly fine. The main thing that you need is just the +1 totem node, and the order of this, by the way, is you'll go +1 Ritual of Awakening, Conviction of Power, and then Arcane Blessing will be the last thing you get. But basically, you just get the +1 node, and then you get a 4-link, which is 1 red, 3 blue, and the colors are Spell Totem, Arc, Added Lightning Damage, and Lightning Penetration. That's going to be your 4-link. So that 4-link, like I said, if needed, that can take you all the way into white and yellow maps, but ideally not, right? So, yeah, definitely something to keep an eye out for. And the main thing that you're going to want to take early that you don't take late is, and you're going to want to take this probably before you even do totems, right? Like, I think that like my starter path on this build is basically like come out here, come up here. I get the health and this to just make things smoother. You don't have to, though. You can come up here and rush Elemental Overload. This is really, really good for early game, right? Because it just 40% more damage is just way better when you don't have any crit or crit multi or anything like that. So you keep this pretty much until, I would say, about Merc Lab, because Merc Lab is where you really start to get a lot of crit, right? Because your power charges come online, then you can get this, you can get this charge, then you can swap to a Diamond Flask. You kind of get the drill. So play this until you get some crit, ideally Merc Lab, and then unspec it at that point and fully invest into crit. And you'll be happy you did, because it does a lot of damage. Okay, so one of the final things I want to talk about with this build is the corruption potential. So I know we said we weren't really going to talk too much about upgrading it beyond the base of what you see here, but I think it is worth mentioning that this particular build is ripe for really easy corruptions. And let's kind of like investigate what I mean by that, right? It's also kind of ripe for upgrades in terms of the Abyss Jewels, because you can kind of start off with like really bad Abyss Jewels and then upgrade them into some really special things. There's actually the very powerful corrupted Abyss Jewels that you can get from the the Atlas tree by speccing into Abyss, that have like extra modifiers on them and stuff like that. So you can get kind of really crazy in this area, but even with just the corruptions, things can get really strong. So you don't really want to corrupt the staff, because you probably want the attack block. I mean, you can corrupt the staff if you want. Let's look at what the corruptions are. If we go to corrupt, I believe like cast speed is the one you'd want. Yeah, you can get 15 cast speed, right? That's going to be like the main thing that you'd be looking for there. But I think overall, I would just prefer to have the attack block. This is a super no-brainer because there's no implicit, and that's how you get the +1 power charge. You can single corrupt this, double corrupt this. This has lots of good potential outcomes on it. So definitely corrupt that. And this is an advantage, too, over not using the Vol's Vision Helm. Because if you use Vol's Vision, you have to sacrifice corruption on everything, which when you take into account the totality of things is actually quite a bit of power. So the Algor Mortis here, there's a lot of good options, as you can see. I already have a crit on here. However, you can have things like +1 to Frenzy Charge is not even that bad for this build. Life and Energy Shield, Cast Speed, all that stuff is pretty decent. You can get +1 to certain types of skills and stuff like that. Then going down to Rainbowstride, I feel like this is actually a particularly good one right here. If we go to Rainbowstride, where is it? Okay. And we go to Corrupt. So you can get movement speed, health, energy shield, and then you can get maximum endurance charge, which isn't necessarily that insane, but you can get spell suppression, which is actually really good. So I would be trying to get movement speed, life, or spell suppression in some form. I think that's really strong. And then the Ephemeral Bond. This is another really insane slot for corruption. If you look, you can get block to attack here, right? Your spell block's probably going to be capped. You can get movement speed, which is really good. Rarity and quantity are never bad. +1 to all res, +1 to all max res, sorry, then +14 to 16 to all res. Then you can get, Determination Aura Effect, an additional curse, which, maybe that's not going to be super useful for you, but you could sell it. So there's tons of good corrupts you could do on the Ephemeral Bond. And Kikazaru is one that I think typically you would probably leave uncorrupted, but if you did get, like, for example, +15 to all resist on your neck, then you could then kind of go ahead and probably corrupt your Kikazaru, right? So if we kind of go into this, you can see that you can get cast speed, you can get flat damage to spells and attacks, quantity and rarity again, right? You can get cool things like cannot be ignited, cannot be poisoned. Those are super helpful. You can get buff effects on the auras and stuff like that again. So yeah, just like really, really good corruptions that you can get on these. And you can also get another +14 to 16 all res, which is kind of wild. And Anathema is a perfect corruption candidate because the 25 energy shield is not going to make or break you. So yeah, this is a really, really strong ring to corrupt. And for things you can do in terms of catalysts, this ring, it's not super good. You can use a cast or catalyst to increase the cast speed. which is pretty decent. You obviously know what the Catalyst is going to do here. For this over here, I believe, let's check out what you can do with the Bond. You can use the crit one to increase the crit damage for sure. You can use an elemental one to increase the resistance one, sorry, to increase the resistances. Those are all good. And let's just see if you can use a caster catalyst and see if it does anything. It does not seem to do anything. Okay. Yeah. So just double checking there. But actually we'll do an elemental one just in case. Okay, it does actually buff the flat damage a little bit. So it's a little bit of extra damage you could get in there. So lots of options you can do for corrupting and catalyzing things. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. This is a really long one, but a lot of information in here. And one last thing I would say is, do not stress. I already talked about the order that we're upgrading the belt and stuff like that, but or the items in general, but do not stress on getting the belt until you have the supplemental jewels, right? Because the belt is pretty much worthless unless you have good Abyss jewels to go with it. If you don't have good Abyss jewels, it's just, you're better off using a rare belt. And what you will use in place of these is you can use anything in place of this. Basically, you don't even have to use another Stygian for another Hypnotic Eye, because you don't even need to be doing the armor stacking until you get this belt, basically, because you're probably not going to be in red maps until then. So you can kind of cruise through all the content in the game just using Wrath or an unbuffed Determination, or a what do you call it? Purity of Elements if you need to help cap resist, right? You can basically do that without investing into like a Stygian Vise and really expensive jewels. And what you would replace Anathema with before you get it. So once you basically get the ability to quality this Kikazaru to get 72% curse effect, and then you are able to take advantage of the Soul of Bugle power for the remaining curse effect, then you will actually take this into a Doedre's Damning, which is this ring right here. And this is actually quite nice because it gives all res. And with having only one additional curse instead of, all the additional curses, what you would basically do in this case is you would just run Elemental Weakness and you would run Conductivity. And the reason why you use both of those is because they can be applied to like large packs of monsters at once, right? Whereas if you use your Mark, it can only be applied to one thing at once. You could also use Enfeeble instead of one of those if you really prefer, but you're not really going to need that until red maps, and even in low red maps, you won't really need Enfeeble with this build. So, yeah, that is basically every last thing we need to go over, I believe. Sorry, this is a little bit long, but I like to be exhaustive. I like to give you guys all of the possible information and details, all the rationale for why we're doing things so that you kind of understand what's going on. And, yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the guide. If you liked the video, please give it a like, subscribe, and comment, or if you just have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Yeah, I'll be streaming probably on Twitch tomorrow, and I'll link the stream in the description of the video if you guys want to come by and check it out. And yeah, I just whether you choose this build or not for League Start, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have fun in Necropolis, and if you're playing Arc Totems, I hope you enjoy them. And there'll be more Totem content to come, so stay posted. Thank you again, and see you guys soon.